Okay, great. I think we have sound now. So I'm really happy to welcome everyone to our panel. I just start with a brief introduction to our speakers, and I think we've all got all of them together now. We have got three speakers today. Pedro Lima is a lecturer in disaster studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. And he's a social anthropologist who has done research with the ICRC and with MSF. And he's also the convener of the Anthropology of Humanitarianism network. Then we have May Zinwin So, who is doing her PhD in Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University in Thailand. At the same time, she's a practitioner with the Convenor Development Institute based in Yangon and a researcher in the Protracted Displacement Economies Project. And she is both influenced in her researcher and her practitioner trajectory by a deep commitment to human rights and peace. And then we have Jean-François Véran, who joins us, who is an anthropology professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who has been researching MSF since 2010, focusing on violence, migration, and epidemics in Central and South America and Africa. So his current research is about how MSF anthropologists apply the analytical tools and methodologies of their discipline to contribute to the development of humanitarian medical programs. So you can see we have a mixture of practitioners, researchers, anthropologists, and humanitarians on this panel. And before I start asking a few questions to our panelists, just a few notes. I would encourage participants to comment on Twitter, now known as X, if you feel like it, using the hashtag HCBerlin. And please can I ask audience members to put questions or comments in the chat. So I'm really keen that we have quite an interactive session, and I know our panelists are really happy to take questions from the audience. So please keep them coming, keep the questions coming, and we'll weave them into our main discussions as soon as they pop up. Okay, I should also mention that we have accessibility, so there will be live captioning as well as live translation into French and Spanish. So before I start with the questions to our panelists, let me just briefly outline what this session is trying to do. So you've heard a lot about attention in the last couple of days, those lucky of you who were there in person. But what we're trying to do in this panel is to try to use anthropology as sort of an in-depth qualitative engagement with people on the ground, both people who are with organizations and people who live there, people who are affected by crises, to understand how attention shapes what they're doing and how they're involved in humanitarianism and the result of its interventions. So how can anthropology specifically, with its tools, help us understand what shapes humanitarian attention? So, for example, what are the structural or missed modes of humanitarian attention, and where do they come from? So what kind of preconception lie behind these particular frames of attention? What kind of identities or even structures enhance, limit, or completely obscure humanitarian attention? And we hope that anthropology can help us understand that a bit better, for example, in relation to colonial legacies. So I've listened to some of the previous panel, which was about narratives, and I think we can pick up the thread of discussion there, how colonial negatives do or may influence contemporary attention economies and narratives. And what can practically humanitarian actors do to overcome them? What kind of checks and accountability measures or mechanisms may be required? So we're trying to look at this in the context of the expertise of our panelists. So I would just like to start with a very, very simple, very broad question asking Pedro. Pedro, can you tell us what might be some of the examples what anthropology can tell us about humanitarian attention?
Great. Thank you, Anne-Meike, for the introduction. I guess I will take the first set of questions rather than the questions about colonialism, as more closely related to my own research. So I think attending the Congress for the past 2 or 3 days, I was really puzzled, and of course I could sympathize with some of the practitioners' frustrations with patterns of attention, especially in media, from donors and etc. So I'd just like to first begin by highlighting some of the ways in which humanitarian attention is potent as well, and it can bring something. And I know a lot of anthropologists have highlighted the fact and the strength of the moral sentiments that are inherent to humanitarianism. So we can think of, the creation or the establishment of humanitarian crisis in itself as being something that draws attention and mobilizes moral sentiments from the broad spectrum of the population or public. And I have one specific example from my own research where ICRC was working in Brazil. As you probably know, Brazil is a country that is plagued with chronic urban violence, with levels of killings that are comparable to conflict settings. And ICRC comes into the picture trying to highlight this specific problem as a humanitarian problem, which wasn't really there before. Try to think of urban violence as a humanitarian issue. And for that reason, through a specific program that they were doing in Rio, which I did my research on, they managed to establish a registration program where certain local state actors suddenly brought humanitarian urban violence as a humanitarian issue into their work, where they were actively working to, for instance, help frontline workers to deal with situations of gun violence. And that was something that these specific local actors were not doing before, but that was brought into their attention, into their work through the ICRC program. Now, I think another aspect that we can think of, sort of going more in line with the title of the panel that I had for my research, is when basically things fall out of sight and are neglected. So, and this, at least what I saw in my own research, happens when there is a pursuit or a focus and attention given to specific programmatic ideas or programmatic goals that for some reason or another, for structural reasons, obscure certain other important issues. So, I mean, I can go more into detail on this. I don't want to take too much time. But in the case of Rio, for instance, a specific goal and pursuit of program continuity, of handing over the program to local authorities, resulted in the reinforcement of local power imbalances that existed between frontline workers and the local state actors, the local city council, and within sort of the primary clinics, whereas I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm happy to take that up later.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. I would like to follow on with a question for Jean-François, and we'll get here into a territory that unites both Jean-François and Meike's expertise, which relates to the intersection of conflict, migration, and humanitarianism. So, Jean-François, how would you say do the legal frameworks and the international definitions around conflict and migration influence the attention of the humanitarian sector? And that's especially considering the complexity of some of today's migration patterns.
Thank you very much, Anne-Meike, for the introduction. So in my experience with MSF, viewing issues through an anthropological lens has often showed the complexities that arise from the intersections of international legal frameworks and ground-level humanitarian responses. Anthropology teaches us somehow that labels and categories, while useful for legal and administrative purpose, can sometimes oversimplify complex human experiences and stories and leave them in the shade. So I have 3 examples I can take very quickly. Migration, as the so-called over situations of violence and sexual violence. These might be examples that might be developed further in the panel. But regarding migration, we know that international law categories fits people in categories like refugees, fleeing conflict protected by conventions, and migrants possibly escaping poverty and environmental health without similar international protections. And we've been conducted intensive ground studies, operational research on migration that shows that, for example, while an organization like MSF uses the category of mixed flows, they tend to reproduce a binary conception of it's oversimplified, but good versus bad migrants. And when you conduct a morphological assessment, you find that most people have mixed reasons to migrate, and they do not constitute as such a mixed flow, and this tends to blur some migration realities. Like, for example, I'm going for operational research in the Darien region between Colombia and Panama next week, and this is typically one of the situations that is under assisted due to a problem in recognizing the status of those migrants. And I can also take very quickly the example, like the international organizations like the UN and the CRC, they use the categories such as international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict versus overt situations of violence. And as Pedro has mentioned, like him, I've been working in Latin American continent and Central America, where we definitely, from the anthropological assessment, we can see that the reality that these people are enduring in terms of impact on health and mental health to chronic exposure to violence is tremendous. And when you go down by numbers, like in Honduras, in between 2010 and 2014, there have been twice as much victims from violence than in the Afghanistan war. I don't like to make cabarrus comparison, but it does show that how labeling puts people under shadow, and also and situations under shadow. And finally, sexual violence. We work usually by the WHO definition, and when you are actually mapping sexual practices to understand what are the access barriers to care for the victims of sexual violence, you understand that it is a lot more complex than that, and that alongside with working on sexual violence, we should be working on sexuality in violent contexts. But I will leave that for further discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we can follow on from there, looking at the migration context in a different place. For May, who's been involved in research and advocacy on the context of internal displacement in Myanmar, how would you say does the attention of humanitarian actors on particular ethnic communities create greater tension within and between these communities potentially?
Thank you for your question, Meike. I will answer this from Lima context. So let me start the answer with the Isabel that my friend told me. So she used to work at the humanitarian organization at the western part of Myanmar. So she gave me this Isabel. So let's imagine a scenario. There are two children. So they are living side by side in a conflict-affected area, but they belong to a different ethnic groups. But if a donor decides to provide support to only one child and leave the other child, what will happen? The other child will feel neglected and excluded. So this Silva Isabel made me realize the critical importance of the impersonality aspect of the humanitarian aid. So I think we should look at this aspect. And it reflects the complex dynamics of the aid distribution in areas with conflicted communities. So in those areas, like not only in that area, there are in other areas of Myanmar, because there are so many ethnic groups living in Myanmar. So there can be this kind of problem happening in Myanmar. So there are two distinct ethnic groups. They may coexist peacefully, living in the villages close to one another. Maybe they may be free for social tensions. But in other parts of the same region, these two groups, they may hate each other and they may harbor deep-seated animosity. So when a international humanitarian organization, they consistently channels their aid to only one of these groups or excluded the other, it can significantly, really worsen the existing social situation and even, escalate the conflict. So this brings us to a crucial point. When organization focus on one specific ethnic group, it can be, it's actually because of their good intention, but they may unknowingly intensify social tensions. So that's why I want to say we need a more balanced and inclusive approach. And organizations, they may adopt a do no harm approach, and maybe when they got that misassessment, maybe they may think of even like human rights, which is like non-discrimination, equality, dignity, and fairness. Yeah, that's one of the contexts, and there are other aspects like gender dimension, or should I tell you now, or should I leave it to the discussion part?
And maybe we'll get back to that in a moment, because I think you've pointed to a really important aspect, and I'm wondering whether we can ask all panelists to think about this. So in the Myanmar context, for example, in terms of ethnicity, but also more broadly in the Brazilian and Latin American context, what do you think are the structural patterns or some of the structural patterns of humanitarian attention? So Pedro, Jean-François, does one of you maybe want to go first? And I should also say, while you're having to think about the patterns of humanitarian attention, any audience questions on these topics or anything that you find important, please pop them into the chat now and then we can get them.
Well, if I may jump in, if we are looking at a pattern that will characterize what is happening in Latin and Central America and probably in other countries in South Asia, is that humanitarian assistance is mistaken by what I call ritualism. Ritualism is when you have a context and you do an explode, you do an assessment, and you look, you talk to the institutions, the local actors, and everything is there. So you have protocols, you have secretaries, subsecretaries, for women, for example, for Black people, for indigenous people. I'm talking about Brazil, but also about Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala, and when you look it down on the paper, it's all there. And what I call ritualism is when you respect the means and you forget about the finalities, the endings. So we go there, we do an assessment, and when where there is no gap, everything is covered. That they have perfect laws, they have integral protocols, protections to sexual violence, and we are being misled by that. So if you don't go grassroots, and if you don't go bottom up, and if you don't challenge what is presented as to be the reality, then you get it wrong. And it's just as simple as that. You know, you may have an integral protocol for attention to sexual violence, and then you go. Like a few years ago, when I went to Acapulco in Mexico, and then we went to the medical records, and there was not one single case reported of sexual violence. So it was not working. So I will say that in many contexts, you have some sensitivity to minorities, to gender issues, to racism, structural racism. When you go down to what is actually being done, there is not much happening. And humanitarian organizations should do a bottom-up assessment to counter this false evidence.
Yes, thanks. So would it be right to say when you say ritualism, you mean sort of deeply embedded, pre-structured ways of responding to things which are itself categorized in particular ways already, which may obscure the vision and lead to particular responses which are not particularly accurate or appropriate?
Actually, what I mean by ritualism is the fact that international organizations, the UN, the pressure of fundings, request that you have laws, that you have specific secretaries. So these nation states, they adopt the means. So they create the structures, the texts, the laws. Like in Brazil, we have a very powerful anti-racist law. We have a lot of action going on the gender issue. And then you have protocols, you have laws, you have actors, and you have no results. That's what I call, actually it's an expression by Robert Merton, the sociologist. What he calls ritualism is exactly that. When you respect the means and you forget about the finalities.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Pedro, picking up from that, do you think there's a link between this kind of shapes of ritualisms and colonial legacies that we can observe?
I think I just want to, if I made any excuse, I think I might just pick up on your earlier question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That made me think, actually, thinking back to the categories that Véran was mentioning in the beginning, and how those categories draw different degrees of attention. When we think of humanitarian crisis in Latin America, we think of the more sort of traditional non-international conflict in Colombia, but we don't think about the high levels of gun violence that exist with cartels in Mexico, for instance. When we think about migration, similarly, we might think about sort of a humanitarian migration crisis. We don't tend to think, or humanitarianism just don't tend to think as much about what is it also happening in Mexico, but also sometimes between Brazil and Venezuela now, which ICRC, and it does have a small program there to help that. And I was also thinking sort of back to these categories, but also back to sort of going back to attention more broadly and how it was framed in the discussions in the Congress. And it seemed like it was very much at the highest possible level you can think of, which makes sense. I think the general sense that I had in the Congress in the past couple of days was where I was with a concern with first media coverage and what crises get forgotten by. And here we are subsuming, of course, that it's the global media. It's the media that has the reach to reach global audiences, not only in specific countries. But then I think, in anthropology, what we also do, I think, very well is the scaling, where we are looking at these different concepts and issues at different scales, not only at this uppermost global level, we're also looking at the national level, we're also looking at most of the times at the very local level. And I think it's important to think about how, humanitarian actors deal with issues of attention on that sphere as well, and to also both to consider the merits of humanitarian work, but also to consider, of course, the blind spots. And my case in Brazil is, I think, is a pretty good example of that, where the attention was very much drawn on a very, very local level, at the level of the municipality of Rio de Janeiro, or actually the north neighboring municipality. But it resulted in something very meaningful, I think, for the
Yeah, I think that's really a key theme also for the Myanmar context, which we're getting to. So I think because anthropology has traditionally focused in its early stages on what we would now call local areas, villages, street corner anthropology and so on. I think it may be uniquely placed to kind of assess what kind of grassroots attention there is, where it is directed to, and what effects it may have. And I think in the Myanmar context, can you tell us a little bit more, what is the role of the informal humanitarian sector in Myanmar in terms of ethnicity, kinship, or youth, for example? Because I think, especially in the absence or lesser presence of large international organizations, the role of these local actors becomes more important in what they direct their attention to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because in Myanmar, conflict has been happening for like more than 70 years. And also because of the recent conflict, recent military coup. So yeah, there are some kind of restrictions for the formal aid system. So I think that's where informal humanitarian aid plays a more significant role in Myanmar. So I feel like I wonder, it's like the conflict, it has many negative aspects, but it also brings positive, it brings local communities closer together. When I talked to the founder of a local environmental group, it used to be an environmental group, but it no longer is an environmental group. Now they have shifted their focus to helping people in conflict-affected area. So they provide emergency support, like food, healthcare training, education materials, mental health support. So they receive funding from local international communities and humanitarian groups. And also, not only that group, there are so many groups like that in Myanmar. Food Noble Solidarity Movement is actually, I think it's a global movement, but it's a global movement idea. It focuses on not only social justice, but also on environmental and like animal rights. But this idea, it brings to Myanmar, and now in Myanmar, because of the conflict, I think it mainly focuses on the social justice. And so they also provide humanitarian aid, and also, so their motto is like solidarity, not charity. Yeah, that's what they would like to frame their support. And also, I have in a few many other groups. So there's like the founder of he is also a founder, but he used to provide support to flat victims. But now, because of the group, he provide emergency support to the IDPs. And especially what interested is like because of the movement participation from a humanitarian international humanitarian organization, they cannot reach to every part of Myanmar. So he focused on the areas, especially how to reach area. So yeah, and he told me like it's very important to build trust with the local communities and the authorities, because some of the places that he provided it is governed by the ethnic organization, and so he needs to obtain the necessary approval to provide it in those areas. So yeah, so and also I also would like to talk about the other informal humanitarian aid like religious or church network. Yeah, because I also interview some people from church network as well. And yeah, they also provide assistance to IDPs. They provide the shelter and they provide support because they have the lands, church lands and religious land. So they provide, they give the land to, they let the IDPs stay in the land. Yeah, and also another interesting thing is like the issue group. The issue group is actually the members are all the IDPs.
Yes.
So
basically, yes.
Yeah. Basically, they found the group and they with friends because some of the group members they are the younger IDPs, like second generation IDP. Because of the recent group, they are like new IDP. So yeah, they provide assistance to the new IDPs and also cross-border support. Yeah, transnational support like CIDDP, a community for internationally displaced people, like other ethnic times, and also Myanmar communities in Western countries, Europe countries. Yeah, they provide a lot of support to Myanmar. And also, I would like to emphasize one project. It's called Bright Star Maternity Back Project. We did the interview. Yeah, Maggie. So she's a Karen, and she saw so many Karen pregnant women fleeing to Thailand because of the coup, and those women do not have access to the emergency to the medical supplies. So that's why she came up with the idea and help those women in need. So I feel like sometimes donors and even media when they talk about the humanitarian aid, they only think of like international aid. And I think in Myanmar, not only the international aid, I think, but also like this kind of informal humanitarian aid plays a really important role. Yeah, that's what I would like to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. So hopefully we could say, or one insight we could take away is that anthropology and this kind of qualitative research, it helps us uncover other forms of humanitarian intervention that are not normally on the forefront of the attention of a global audience, policy actors, or international organizations. Some of them are obviously aware of it, but it is not as widespread as, large, high-level interventions. And I was thinking, it's interesting, you mentioned sort of IDPs helping each other, even sharing land, or, pregnant women supporting others. I think in the previous panel on narratives, was it John Bryant who mentioned the word solidarity? And I thought it was really interesting because he said, well, it's not clear how useful this is in terms of maintaining attention and support. But independent of that, it is really interesting that this may simply what is happening. Yeah, independent of a global audience. It is, the bonds of solidarity that extend between IDPs, for example, and people in similar situations, ethnic communities, faith communities, and so on.
Yeah.
I kind of. Let me just hang on. Let me just make sure we get to our other questions that we've got in the in mind. Maybe either Pedro or Jean-François, what would you say? What kind of critique of humanitarian attention is anthropology uniquely placed to make? Whoever feels free to respond to it.
On that, I can respond both in two ways. first, the traditional critical tradition of anthropology would say that no, the humanitarian response is tied with powers, issue of powers, issue of recognition, issue of like we've mentioned, donors, the emotional aspect of donors, turning a spectacle into an action to donate money. This is the classical critique. From my experience, I don't do I do anthropology in humanitarian situation. I don't do anthropology of humanitarian action. So when I'm in a humanitarian situation, I can give you an example. I was quickly mentioning like sexual violence. It's something that is deeply embedded within preconceptions and definitions, and often legal and societal labels delineate what qualifies as sexual violence. However, an anthropological approach reveals a broader spectrum of experiences that may not nearly fit into these established categories. And this broader spectrum is what, I call the gray zone of consent. But my anthropological assessments on sexual violence typically aim to uncover and address the barriers to accessing care. And it became quite evident that traditional definitions of sexual violence often overlook or invalidate the experiences of many victims. And this definition can unintentionally exclude experiences that don't fit the standard narrative, yet are deeply traumatic and consequential for those involved. And one of my fights within the MSF movement has been not to challenge the concept of sexual violence, but to put aside the concept of sexuality in a violent context, which basically means that if you are in a hyper-violent context, basically all sexual relations and gender relations are marked by the violent environment. And so it's my critique will be, in this specific case, to who do we give or do not give the PrEP, the post-exposition kit? And by the way we communicate with health promotion strategies, we often confound what we would like people to fit in and the reality is that people actually leave, and we leave aside people that don't come to our facilities, to our clinics, because they don't recognize themselves in the way that we talk to them. So, I will conclude my main critique will be quoting Adrienne Rich, the poet, and when she says, "This is your oppressor's language, yet I needed to talk to you. So this is my language and I needed to talk to you."
Thank you. That's very poignant. Pedro, you convened the Anthropology of Humanitarianism network. And from that unique perspective, what kind of critiques do you think anthropology can make? And then we're getting on to questions, audience questions.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I really wanted to jump in on that question as well. I think it was, I can totally relate, I think, to Jean-François' frustration with sort of the role that definitions and categories have, how they can be sort of erasing as well. I mean, from my own information, I actually not anthropologist initially. I was more in international relations and sort of working a lot, studying a lot about IHL, and felt very freed from that framework when I started doing anthropology, which has a much broader outlook that is actually looking at what's happening on the ground and asking, what is going on here. And I think that it's good to start maybe with, I realized that we haven't really maybe explained to the lay audience what anthropology essentially entails, which is essential, I think, to understand what it brings to the table, right? So it really entails that long-term immersion within a social setting from all the anthropologists to basically understand the meanings that people attribute to certain things in their daily lives, and to basically understand, what matters to them and how they make sense of it. And I think in that sense, we do have to tend to have a very sympathetic view, a very empathetic view with our informants. We try to take what they tell us seriously, and we try to understand their worldviews and their perspectives in their own terms, sometimes, as much as possible, of course. And that, of course, doesn't mean that we might, support certain views against human rights, etc. But it means that we're trying to understand how they think. And I think that in the humanitarian setting, I think that's really important because it's, at the very least, on a very basic level, it's someone who is not from the setting most of the times, who is coming to look at the situation from a from an observer standpoint. We're not simply observants, we're participating, we're engaging in people, we might be helping them do something on the ground. I think from that perspective can emerge from that perspective of sort of the empathetic, the understanding perspective of anthropologists through a long term to try to really understand what life is like, what work is like for these people. And is I think essentially how we can achieve something that, it might bring to the fore, it might bring to view things that people weren't really conscious of, that weren't really aware of. It might bring a different perspective. I think that through my own work with ICRC, I was really trying as much as I could to feedback what I was thinking about my work as I did it back to them, with the view of really to help them rethink their work, maybe improve their program. And I was really happy to hear from them that, the main thing that they heard was that I had never really thought about this from this perspective. You made me think about this, my own work, which I do every day, in a different light. And I think that is something that we as anthropologists aim to do, to make the familiar strange and to make the strange familiar. That's a very sort of recurring, phrase that we use. So I think through that, we can hopefully bring reflections to humanitarian practitioners that, they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yes, thank you. And that would include reflection on attentions, patterns on attention, and so on. I should say, it's hard to see for us who's in the audience, so you may all be experts. I'm sure you are on your fields. So, but if, obviously there are no simple questions. So if anybody feels like putting a question in the chat, as in what is anthropology and how does it matter to humanitarianism, please put it in, because we can't really take anything for granted and they're fair questions. I just look at the most recent here. How can anthropologists help humanitarians understand and reflect on their own identities and on the humanitarian culture in order to finally improve humanitarian action? And maybe perhaps start with Jean-François. What do you think?
I think this is a very good question. And I kind of half a joke. I used to say that when I'm called to give support to a project, people expect me to talk about the other's culture, and usually they are calling because there is a blockage somewhere in the humanitarian response, something that is not working well, and it is assumed to be the other's culture is a problem. And what I'll always do, although I do not bypass the cultural dimension of the issue, I just turn over the mirror to the organization, in this case to MSF, and we are traveling, we are present in 79 countries, I think, this year, and with one very specific way of looking at human suffering, a very protocolized conception of humanitarian action, and we have our own cultural codes, of course, as an institution, as in any other institution. So I will give examples of how to improve from the anthropological lens. How did we actually improve humanitarian response? By introducing systematically the issue of analyzing the balance of power within each project. This is something very concrete. We have tools for that. That's called, for example, strategic analysis, and you cannot any longer act in a setting and without turning perfectly conscious what is the position of the project within the local balance of power. Another dimension that we have put is that the top-down culture of a decision-making process has been over time challenged by a conception which is a lot more bottom-up and participatory. And these are not plain words. It will imply that people are consulted in the very conception of the project by asking simple questions like, what do you need actually? And so it's not, doing participation for the health of it, for the sake of it. It's just actually reframing the way that you build your decisions on a real consultation of local populations. And finally, we are, as anthropologists, bugging, not too much, but yet bugging on the post-colonial agenda, which is pretty much connected to my first point, the balance of power. And we have to accept, and we have to deal with the fact that local populations are year after year more aware of the post-colonial agenda, and this shapes or reshapes the way that they relate to us, and this must be incorporated. So I give 3 examples of how anthropologists can help humanitarians understand and reflect on their own identities.
Thanks. That's really helpful. There's a couple of follow-up questions, but before we move on to those, I'm just curious, May, in your ethnographic work with IDPs, do you think this kind of approach by being in the place, being with the people over a long period of time, how has that helped you understand their situation? What difference has it made? In terms of, having a bit more time to be with people, to ask their stories, to understand. Also, because to some extent you're an insider because you know their situation, but you're also an outsider because you're not from their ethnic community necessarily.
Yes, so it makes me understand their culture more deeply. I mean, like you said, I'm an outsider, but when I go there, I need to be very open-minded, and also I need to be very polite, or how to say, so that they can be very open. That's how I can learn their culture more. So so anthropology, maybe how to say, our history in a few the kind of approach, or when I go to the research area and when I talk with IDPs, it can make me understand my own cultural biases as well. Sometimes I have my own cultural biases. So it helps me to have more culturally sensitive humanitarian practice. And also I would like to mention about the participatory approach that is already mentioned here. I think a participatory approach is really important as well. So I think when we design the aid project, because normally in our country, what happens is the donors, the international organization, they come into the project area. Because we sometimes see it, they come into the project area, they have already, they have their own agenda. Okay, they will do this. Maybe they will bring, they will only give food to this. So they don't really listen to the local voices. Maybe one is that I went to one rural area in Myanmar, and what they really need is they need food, or they need money to buy food. But what the humanitarian organization they give, what they give is dignity kit. So the woman they complain it would be better if I was eat food, or those kind of things. That's why I think anthropology approach, I think it makes me realize what is really needed in the ground, and it maybe it helps us realize the importance of the product approach and participatory approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting. Let's stick with that question for a moment about humanitarian identities that you've already started talking to, Jean-François. It strikes me that there's also an assumption of who humanitarians are that is linked to that question. And what we can see from, the grassroots approaches that you mentioned, Jean-François, and your point, May, so about local communities, IDPs themselves being humanitarian actors, that gives the question really an additional perspective or additional dimension, because IDPs themselves are or can be humanitarian actors. And so how do their identities matter? We can't probably answer that just right now, but I think, Pedro, you had a follow-up question. Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, I was just sending it over to May, but I was really interested by the discussion about solidarity, because it did come up in other sessions of the Congress during the in-person sessions, and I sort of thinking about the works of other anthropologists, I've done a bit of history as well. Like Čaran Brkovic is doing currently some research on the Yugoslavian Red Cross, who during some of the movement meetings was pushing for ideas of decolonization and anti-colonialism to be incorporated into the principles and ideas of the movement. And of course, as we know, that was not successful, but that brought to mind sort of the different conceptions, different focuses that different countries might have when it comes to humanitarianism. And I think that speaks to the context of Myanmar. So the question that I had for May was whether she could talk a little bit more about what is at the fore, of the humanitarian concern and attention in Myanmar, like solidarity, that you think maybe differs from that of the more Western conceptions of humanitarianism.
First of all, when we mention about solidarity, in the social media, what we say is with people, we only have us. Like, how to say, citizen, we only have us. We don't have other people to depend on. We don't have other people to rely on. This kind of concept, So that means we don't have international organization that we can rely on. Because IDPs, they feel that because sometimes they look for humanitarian aid, but the aid is not coming, sometimes they lose their hope. So that's how this kind of concept comes in Myanmar. In Facebook social media, we always say that we only have us, those kind of statements. So that's how solidarity movement is kind of popular in Myanmar. And so many humanitarian groups tend to use solidarity, mutual aid, not charity. So those kind of things, yeah. So that's the main concept.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point about, what are local understandings and practices of solidarity and what are they based on. So I think that's a great new research direction that Anthropology is hoping, and that's our last question, to what extent humanitarian insights, for example, the variations of what solidarity might mean, how might that improve humanitarian practice. I want to quickly recoup to the chat question we got a bit earlier, going back to insider anthropology. So I think you can all see it, but I read it out. So Jean-François, do you feel that insider anthropology, that means anthropologists who are hired as humanitarian workers, adopt both of these identities, so of anthropologist and of humanitarian worker? Is that somehow inherently compromised in terms of methods, disciplinarity, and politically?
Well, I think that what I do, I label it as applied anthropology, and I'm definitely an insider in the sense that I adhere to the core values of MSF. I believe in the organization, and I also think that the critical tradition of anthropology must somehow stop when it comes to really listening to over competencies, knowledge. Like when a medical doctor tells you about cholera, you don't need to deconstruct a medical discourse on cholera. You take it for granted and you work with that. So what I'm saying is that the difference as being an insider is that you are applying the ethical rules of your discipline, the methodology, the theory, but you apply it for something else than to develop anthropology, and you apply it to concrete situations. You just one more sitting at the table and earning your right to sit at the table by contributing to solve concrete issues in concrete settings. And I must say that anthropology within humanitarian action as insiders have not always worked well because of this lack from the anthropologists of taking seriously the issue of time frame, the issue of practicalities, the issue of collaboration, and we have improved a lot over the years. And within the MSF movement, anthropology has gained quite some consistencies by showing that it can actually contribute to solve concrete solutions in the conditions that we as anthropologists agree to commit ourselves to concrete solutions for concrete situations, and by developing tools for that. And finally, my last insider-outsider solidarity argument. I think that one of our missions as insiders is to help people to have an adequate use of the concept of culture, because you have a global understanding of what is cultural relativism. But quite some time in the project, I found out that people have a misconception of the issues of culture. Like they will all either blame it on culture and they will say it's not working because of this culture, or they will say leave the people alone with their culture, which is kind of condescending when you are in a crisis situation. So help people to adequately locate culture within concrete settings is probably one of our best contributions, if we commit to do so.
Thank you. I think that leads to our other question very well. So given what anthropology possibly has to offer, do you think, either as anthropologists yourself or because you've worked with some, should humanitarian organizations include an anthropologist colleague in every project setup? And what is the reality, for example, in MSF or in others, I guess, to how many actually work in this area? Pedro, do you want to take the lead on that?
Sure. I mean, I heard François shaking his head, and I saw him shaking his head already, and I think I agree. We
agree to disagree.
Yeah. Well, I think I disagree. Sort of disagree slightly with the question, but disagree with François' reaction. But I think it is too much, a little bit too much. It is within specific settings that it makes sense to have an anthropologist work with the organization, and it is in the situations where there's a specific problem that the organization is trying to understand that they see would fit better answered by anthropologists. I recently worked as doing research for MSF and doing user research for their international publications team and try to understand how their medical guidelines could be better adapted for the needs of staff around the globe. And, that requires knowing a little bit more what the reality of the staff all around the world is, surveying, interviewing, and all of that. So, it's really the work of research. Anthropologists are researchers, and when we need researchers, probably in specific kinds of research is when anthropologists are needed. I think I'll just leave it there and just pass it on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, so we haven't really scripted that. But what I would like to ask everybody in the panel, unless there's any more audience questions, what is your sort of final one or two liners or sentences in terms of how anthropology matters for humanitarian practice? What would you want people to take away from this, especially those who haven't really thought lots about it before? You can all have a minute to think, but who would like to start? Jean-François?
I can start.
Okay.
Together those routes. I think I would really mostly summarize some of the key points of what I said before. What we can really bring to the table is that, if you like, outsider, not always outsider, but the distance perspective of someone who's coming into a situation from outside. And, really through the long-term immersion, really trying to understand what's happening in the context and trying to help people understand better, reflect on their work, on what's happening better. I think that's something that's also important to highlight that I didn't mention before. Some people might think of anthropology as being something still that is about culture and about deciphering culture. And that might think that anthropologists might be cultural brokers, for instance, of trying to translate cultural norms for local populations in different cultures to the humanitarian sector. That is not necessarily always the case. And I think there's also been a movement in the recent decades already, being pretty ingrained, of localization, of hiring more people from the setting where humanitarian workers work. That already does that work of communication and facilitating understanding between both sides. But I think it's really thinking about how anthropologists can also look at humanitarian organizations and practitioners themselves and see what provide different reflections that they didn't think of before. And what I was saying earlier about sort of providing that reflection of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, I think is essentially a question of attention as well that this panel was about, right? It's because humanitarian work is to other pressures that, of course, you're all familiar with the work. There are certain issues and topics that you really focus your attention on. You focus on their needs, you focus on embodied by the humanitarian principles, etc., the goals of the program and the objectives you have. And for that reason, because it is a very focused, attention-heavy type of work, some certain things, naturally, we're all humans, they fall out of view. They become neglected. They're lost. They're out of sight. And I think that's really where anthropologists can really make a big thing.
Thanks, Pedro. That's really strong. That's strongly put. Jean-François, what do you think? 1 or 2 thoughts?
Well, my key points will be anthropology must, I don't think it is something that should be systematic. It's a matter of time frame. What in the life of a project, I would strongly advise that in some settings that are not set as well known, that include an anthropologist during an expo. When there is a blockage with community engagement in some situations, and also I would say that anthropology is not necessarily should be practiced by an anthropologist. And I think some key lessons from anthropology can be transversalized and socialized to all the actors of a humanitarian response. And so I would definitely advise that, like in MSF, we have a preparation for departure into mission that include some anthropological key points to make people aware of what to look and what to be aware of. And so this is definitely something I would advocate for. Transversalize the key elements of anthropological reflection within a humanitarian project. And finally, I would say that let the anthropologists be the watcher of power balance and monitor how the post-colonial and agenda is feeding our relations with the populations. So yeah, that would be my key.
Thank you. Thanks. May, what do you think? What's your key point? What do you want people to take home? What is the role, or how does anthropology matter for humanitarian intervention?
Yeah, for me, I think anthropology, understanding about anthropology, I think it's very beneficial for humanitarian practitioners. By using the anthropology approach, we can understand the local culture and also their local cultures. It can help with local knowledge immigration. So that's one thing. Another thing is how do you say, like I mentioned, participatory approach, so it will help with community engagement. And also another thing that I wanted to mention it at the first, but I forgot to do it. So I will say it will help with also gender and inclusivity as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think hopefully we've all taken a range of perspectives away from this. From my own perspective, I think taking up from the audience questions of humanitarian identities may also be more diverse than we think they are, including, for example, in the previous panel, people who used to be IDPs or refugees who are now humanitarian actors and possibly anthropologists. So the distinction between that are not as clear-cut anymore, which I think is a great thing. Okay, with that, we conclude. Thanks, everybody, for coming and listening. We're looking forward to the next panel, which will be at 2:30 on social media, activism and advocacy, advantages and limitations. Thanks for now.